When Alexander Petrov inherited his great-uncle's estate, he thought it would be the perfect opportunity to start fresh. The old Victorian mansion had been vacant for nearly 2 decades, left to decay after his uncle's mysterious disappearance. Standing before the imposing structure, Alexander felt both excitement and unease. The house loomed against the darkening sky, its Gothic spires piercing the gathering storm clouds. He had always heard whispers about the family's dark past, but dismissed them as mere superstition. The heavy wooden door creaked open with surprising ease, revealing a grand foyer covered in dust and cobwebs. His footsteps echoed through the empty halls as he explored room after room, each more elaborate than the last. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears from the high ceilings, while portraits of stern-faced ancestors watched his every move. As night fell, Alexander decided to investigate the upper floors, unaware that he was no longer alone in the house. The second floor held secrets that made Alexander's skin crawl. As he climbed the grand staircase, his footsteps seemed to echo with voices that weren't his own. The air grew thick and cold, despite the warm evening outside. In the master bedroom, he found his uncle's personal effects scattered across a mahogany desk. Old photographs showed family gatherings from decades past, but in several images, shadowy figures stood behind the smiling faces. Alexander rubbed his eyes, convinced he was imagining things. But when he looked again, the figures remained. The sensation of being watched became overwhelming as he moved through the hallway. His lantern cast dancing shadows on the walls, but some shadows moved independently of his light. A chill ran down his spine when he noticed his own shadow stretching impossibly long behind him, its movement slightly delayed from his own. In the corner of his vision, he glimpsed darker shapes that vanished when he turned to look directly at them. The first clear apparition appeared in the library during Alexander's third night in the house. He had been reading his uncle's journals, searching for explanations about the family's troubled history. The temperature in the room plummeted suddenly, his breath becoming visible in the air. When he looked up from the yellowed pages, a woman in a white dress stood before him, her translucent form flickering like a dying candle flame. Her eyes were hollow sockets that seemed to absorb all light, yet they bore into his soul with immeasurable sadness. She raised a spectral hand, pointing toward the fireplace where a hidden compartment revealed documents detailing the family's involvement in occult practices. Alexander's hands trembled as he realized his uncle hadn't simply disappeared. The ghostly woman's mouth moved soundlessly, her lips forming words he couldn't hear but somehow understood. She was trying to warn him about something far more sinister than he had imagined. Nightmares plagued Alexander's sleep as the house's spirits grew bolder. He dreamed of shadowy figures gathering around his bed, their faces twisted in eternal torment. These weren't the gentle ghosts of folklore, but malevolent entities that seemed to feed on his fear. In his dreams, he saw his uncle's final moments, trapped in a circle of chanting figures who performed rituals that should have remained buried. The house itself was alive, its walls pulsing with dark energy that seeped into his consciousness. Each morning, Alexander woke more exhausted than when he had gone to sleep, dark circles forming under his eyes. He began to notice physical changes in the house during daylight hours. Doors that he had closed would be open, furniture moved from its previous position, and new cracks appearing in the walls like spreading veins. The portraits seemed to follow his movements with their painted eyes, and he could swear he heard whispered conversations in languages he didn't recognize. The full extent of the haunting revealed itself on a seemingly ordinary afternoon. Alexander was examining the house's architectural details when the temperature dropped so suddenly that ice formed on the windows. The chandelier above began to sway without any breeze, its crystals chiming an eerie melody. Then they came, dozens of spirits materializing from the walls, floor, and ceiling like smoke given form. An entire family procession descended the grand staircase, each member bearing the marks of their violent deaths. A woman with a noose around her neck glided past him, her feet never touching the steps. Children with hollow eyes played an invisible game in the corner, their laughter echoing with unnatural resonance. Men in business suits carried invisible burdens, their faces etched with eternal suffering. Alexander pressed himself against the wall, paralyzed by the supernatural spectacle. These weren't random spirits but the cursed souls of his own bloodline, trapped in the house by dark rituals performed generations ago. His uncle's journals contained the horrifying truth about the family's legacy. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a prison for souls bound by blood magic. Generation after generation, the Petrov family had practiced necromancy, summoning spirits to serve their selfish desires. But the entities they called forth were not servants to be commanded, but masters who demanded payment in kind. Each family member who died within these walls became part of the collection, their souls trapped to fuel the dark rituals of their successors. Alexander's great-uncle had been the last practitioner, attempting to break the curse but failing catastrophically. The final entry in the journal described how he had tried to send the spirits back to their realm, only to become their latest victim. As Alexander read these words, ghostly hands emerged from the pages, their fingers like ice against his skin. The book began to glow with an unholy light, and he could feel the spirits pressing against his consciousness, hungry for a new host. The basement revealed the house's darkest secret. Alexander descended the creaking stairs with trepidation, his lantern cutting through the oppressive darkness. The walls were covered with symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering light, painted in substances that he refused to identify. Ritual circles dominated the stone floor, their intricate patterns designed to contain and control supernatural forces. Wooden tables held implements of dark magic, from ancient daggers to crystal orbs that pulsed with inner light. In the center of the largest circle lay his uncle's remains, perfectly preserved despite the years. The body was positioned as if in the middle of a ritual, hands raised toward symbols that glowed with malevolent energy. Alexander realized that his uncle's attempt to break the curse had actually strengthened it. Every failed ritual had added more power to the house's malevolent influence, making escape increasingly impossible. The air hummed with electrical energy, and he could feel the spirits gathering around him, eager to prevent him from leaving as their predecessors had been prevented. Armed with knowledge from his uncle's journals, Alexander decided to attempt the ritual that had claimed his predecessor's life. He gathered the necessary components, drew the protective symbols, and positioned himself at the center of the largest circle. The spirits watched with intense interest, their forms flickering between hope and despair. Some had been trapped for over a century, their memories of life reduced to fragments of pain and longing. As Alexander began the incantation, the house itself seemed to resist. Doors slammed shut throughout the mansion, windows cracked without being touched, and the temperature fluctuated wildly. The spirits pressed closer, their whispers filling his mind with doubts and fears. His uncle's voice joined the chorus, warning him to stop before it was too late. But Alexander pressed on, his voice growing stronger as he called upon forces beyond human comprehension. The symbols blazed with brilliant light, and he felt the spirits' bonds beginning to weaken. The ritual's disruption sent shockwaves through the house's supernatural foundations. Walls cracked and split, releasing decades of accumulated dark energy. Furniture levitated and crashed to the floor, while portraits screamed with the voices of the damned. The spirits that had been bound to the house for generations found their chains breaking, but instead of finding freedom, they became more violent and desperate. Alexander's attempt to free them had only made them hungrier for release, and they turned their fury on the living world. The house shook with supernatural earthquakes, its very foundation protesting the disturbance of ancient forces. In the library, books flew from shelves like birds taking flight, their pages fluttering with ghostly hands. The chandeliers crashed to the floor, their crystals shattering into pieces that seemed to absorb light itself. Through it all, Alexander could hear his uncle's laughter echoing from the basement, a sound that chilled him more than any ghostly wail. When Alexander regained consciousness, he found himself surrounded by concerned spirits who had never shown him kindness before. The ritual had drained him of nearly all his life force, leaving him pale and barely breathing. The ghostly figures hovered protectively around his prone form, their expressions filled with guilt and fear. They had realized that his death would only strengthen the curse that bound them. His uncle's spirit appeared, finally free from the ritual circle but unable to leave his beloved house. The old man's translucent form knelt beside his nephew, his hollow eyes filled with remorse for the legacy of darkness he had created. Through labored breaths, Alexander learned that the spirits could not directly harm the living, but their presence accelerated the natural processes of death and decay. The house itself was feeding on his life energy, drawing him deeper into its supernatural web. Every moment he remained within its walls weakened his connection to the living world, making it harder to escape with each passing hour. With his remaining strength, Alexander began documenting everything he had learned, hoping that someone else might succeed where he had failed. His uncle's spirit guided his shaking hand, revealing the true names of the entities that had been summoned generations ago. Each name written in the journal seemed to pulse with dark energy, as if the spirits themselves were acknowledging their identification. The ghostly figures gathered around him, their attention focused on every word he penned. They understood that this knowledge was their only hope for release, and they watched with desperate intensity as he recorded the complex ritual that might finally break their bonds. Alexander's handwriting grew increasingly illegible as his strength faded, but he pressed on with unwavering determination. The spirits whispered corrections and additions, their voices growing clearer as they focused their collective energy on the task. Outside the mansion's windows, the natural world seemed to hold its breath, as if sensing the importance of what was being recorded within those cursed walls. The completion of the journal marked a turning point in Alexander's supernatural ordeal. As he wrote the final words, the spirits around him began to change, their forms becoming more solid and peaceful. They no longer flickered with malevolent energy but glowed with a gentle light that spoke of hope finally realized. His uncle's spirit smiled for the first time since Alexander's arrival, the expression transforming his ghostly features from haunting to almost paternal. The house itself seemed to respond to the positive energy, its walls stopping their supernatural trembling and the cracks beginning to seal. The spirits gathered around Alexander in a circle of gratitude, their whispers now sounds of thanks rather than threats. They told him of their lives before the curse, sharing memories that had been buried beneath centuries of torment. Each story was a thread in the tapestry of family history, connecting Alexander to his heritage in ways both beautiful and tragic. The journal in his hands felt warm, as if it were alive with the combined energy of every spirit who had contributed to its creation. The final ritual required all of Alexander's remaining strength and the combined energy of every spirit bound to the house. They formed a perfect circle in the main hall, their translucent forms glowing with accumulated power. Alexander stood at the center, the journal open in his hands as he spoke the words that would either free them all or doom them forever. The house resonated with supernatural energy, its walls vibrating with the force of the ancient magic being unleashed. Each spirit began to fade, their forms becoming more ethereal as they prepared to cross over to whatever realm awaited them. His uncle's spirit was the last to speak, his voice filled with pride and love as he told Alexander that he had succeeded where others had failed. The curse was breaking, but the process required one final sacrifice. Alexander felt his own life force flowing into the ritual, but he welcomed it as the price of freedom for his family's tortured souls. The light grew so brilliant that he could see nothing else, and in that moment of pure energy, he understood that some victories were worth any cost. As consciousness faded, Alexander felt the spirits of his ancestors flowing past him like a river of light. Each soul that had been trapped for decades or centuries finally found its way to whatever peace awaited beyond the mortal realm. They passed through him without malice, their gratitude palpable even in his semi-conscious state. The house began to heal around them, its walls knitting themselves back together, the cracks sealing with supernatural speed. Paintings straightened themselves on the walls, furniture returned to its proper positions, and the air cleared of the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the estate for so long. His uncle's spirit paused beside him one final time, placing a ghostly hand on his forehead in a gesture of blessing. The old man's voice whispered words of love and pride, telling Alexander that he had restored honor to their family name. Then he too ascended, his form dissolving into the brilliant light that filled the hall. Alexander smiled in his unconscious state, knowing that he had accomplished what generations of his family had failed to achieve. When Alexander awoke, he found himself in a house transformed. The mansion had been restored to its original glory, every trace of supernatural corruption erased as if it had never existed. Sunlight streamed through crystal-clean windows, illuminating rooms that sparkled with fresh paint and polished wood. The oppressive atmosphere had been replaced by a sense of peace that made his soul feel lighter than it had in weeks. He walked through halls that no longer echoed with ghostly whispers, past portraits whose subjects now smiled with genuine warmth. The library contained books that told only the true history of his family, without the dark chapters that had been hidden for so long. In the basement, he found only storage rooms filled with legitimate family heirlooms, the ritual chamber having vanished completely. His uncle's remains had been moved to a proper resting place, and the family curse existed now only as a cautionary tale in the restored journal. Alexander realized that he had not just inherited a house, but had been given the chance to create a new legacy free from the shadows of the past.